Hello and welcome to Faith Talks. In today's program, we'll be asking, is Britain a Christian nation? Joining me in the studio today are Pastor James Shepley and Pastor Douglas McCormack. Welcome. Now, can a nation or can a country be defined as Christian, James?
I think it's a really good question, Kirsten. I think that you would probably have to make a distinction between nation, as in the people or the people groups comprising that particular territory, and state, the levers of power and control. And those two things are a little different.
Because we used to define countries as being Christian or Muslim, and why is that so important for us to actually define countries with a religion? What do you say, Doug?
Ooh. You know, I grew up in Northern Ireland, and in many ways, you know, that idea of Ireland being a Christian country, traditionally, you know, the Republic was seen as Roman Catholic and the North was seen as predominantly Protestant. In many ways, defining it as a Christian country was the root of some of the problems that existed over the last 200-300 years, as people sought to, in many ways, enforce their Christian identity, whether it was Catholic or Protestant. And so, you know, I suppose that label made it quite difficult when it came to actually trying to bring these two communities together.
And yet they were both a Christian community.
Yes.
So we're looking around the world and we're seeing a lot of various world religions, and some are more prominent in some states or in some countries. Who makes those calls?
Well, obviously it's depending from country to country, and it's depending on the politics or the history of the country in question, isn't it? The leaders often are making those calls. If we think of the history of Britain, and we think about when Britain became a Christian nation, then some of those choices were made by leaders. You know, you think about back to Anglo-Saxon times, and some of the kings were deciding that Northumbria, say, was going to be Christian. But that's not quite the same thing as people and the population being Christian. Christianity is moving from everywhere to everywhere, I'd say today.
So what would you say would be a hallmark of a Christian nation?
I think when you look at the idea of nationhood, there is a culture and a history that is involved, and so, you know, Christianity has played a significant part in what has made modern Britain. And so it's not just a statement that, you know, David Cameron makes in isolation. He's not just referring to something that exists in this moment. He's actually referring to a rich historical past that has been very much involved in every aspect of life, right from the highest levels of government all the way down to people in their homes.
But why do we see there being such a strong reaction to when the Prime Minister makes such a claim? Why is that?
Because some people feel included and other people feel excluded. I think it's as simple as that. I mean, he was making what was described as a fairly sort of objective historical statement, and in some ways it is, because we think about the role that Christianity's played in the past. We think about the role of the monarch, for instance, as the defender of the faith. We think about the link between church and state historically. So, objectively speaking, that's true. But if you think about a pluralistic society in which we live today, where there are people who are of all different faiths and none, then some people feel excluded by that statement that Britain is a Christian nation.
But let's turn it around and say, well, are we also defining Britain as being Christian by our politics?
I think it's intriguing when you look at the people who came out in support of the statement that David Cameron made. You know, when you have the leader of the UK Hindu Council, and the leader of one of the largest Muslim groups, actually saying, well, you know, there's nothing there's nothing wrong with saying that this is a Christian country because of its rich historical past and the fact that so much of the population actually sees themselves as Christian. And in many ways, I read the response that was printed in the newspaper opposing the statement, and how they described it as something that encourages intolerance and divisiveness. And actually, you know what? That I thought to myself, well, actually, that's a completely gross misunderstanding of Christian values, which Christianity is supposed to be about service. It's supposed to be about tolerance. It's supposed to be about love. And yet, here is a significant group of influential people who are saying, well, actually, we don't see Christianity that way, and rather, we'd rather it wasn't a part of the landscape at all.
But can we get rid of it being historically a Christian? Can we just erase that part and say, well, we want to create something new?
No, not unless we want to have a Soviet-style experiment. We can't do that. We have to recognise the past and the role that churches and Christian people play in the present. Because you say, I don't know about the number of people who are actually attending church, but the number of people in the 2011 census who said they were still Christians was 59%. That's still over the halfway mark. It's down from 2001, which was 72%, so that's a significant change. But it's still a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, yet we're hearing of churches closing because nobody's worshipping in it. How does that match up with people professing to be Christian and empty churches?
Well, empty churches there certainly are, but they're also very, very full churches. I think about Cheltenham, where I'm living right now. It's packed full of churches, and the churches, many of them are packed too. This Sunday went to a church, St Matthew's. Alistair McGrath was speaking there. There were 350, 400 worshippers there, and listening to Alistair McGrath. So I think there are many areas in the UK where Christianity is alive and well and very, very vibrant. What
do you see? Is the faith picture changing?
I think completely the faith picture has changed. In many ways, some of the Christian institutions which have been so much a part of the country have struggled to remain relevant. There are churches who have managed to bridge that gap, who have sought to serve the communities of which they're a part. And you see that in the vibrancy of the congregations, as James has said. But there are other aspects of the Christian church that have struggled to remain relevant, have struggled to have any sense of meaning in the 21st century.
Yet the struggling churches seem to be those who are keeping the traditions going, or am I wrong?
You mean that it tends to be the newer churches, the newer denominations, the mega churches which are growing? Well, I think that's certainly a feature of the landscape today, yeah.
And I think that brings it back to if you are grown up here, what is the likelihood of you growing up in a church?
Well, I think when we look at the statistics and we look at, say, the number of younger people who've never been into a church at all, I forget exactly the percentage, but it's a significant minority of young people who've never been into a church at all, never had that exposure. And that, of course, is a significant worry for the transmission of values, even basic understanding of where you came from, what were the factors that shaped the nation, if you like.
And are some of those, if they are being absent and not being taught to the next generations, will we continue to see Christian values being a dominant factor in decisions made for this country?
Yeah,
I think they're going to have a lesser influence. We have been talking, certainly over the last number of months, years. What are some of the Christian values that have had such an influence, and the ideas of freedom, the idea of service, these are things that have been a significant part of living in the United Kingdom, and we have sought I suppose, to almost export some of those. Some might argue unsuccessfully. But even now in our own society, we're struggling with what actually what role do these Christian values have, whether they're relevant and if they have a role to play. Some people would rather say, well, all right, we can talk about freedom, but we're not going to talk about it from a Christian perspective. Yes, we know that's an inalienable right, but we don't care. We don't want to know where it's come from.
Can we leave Christianity out of a discussion like that, Douglas? Because if this is where we're basing values and wanting to keep that freedom going, can we just take the faith part out of the value and still run with it as a nation?
I think Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop, in some ways he agreed with the statement that Britain is Christian, but he wanted to take it a step further. He wanted to say that it was post-Christian. Sometimes, I think the reality is we accept many of these values that have come from the Christian church. But society wants to reinterpret those. They want to reinterpret them without the church, and say, well, actually, a lot of these values are relevant to us, but they're saying in many ways the church is no longer relevant. And I think as Christians, our challenge is well, actually, do you know what? This is where it came from. We are still relevant, so we are. Christ, when he came to this world 2,000 years ago, brought an inclusiveness that was simply absent from the religious structures, and said, well, actually, do you know what? This is what life and what treating other people is all about.
You're talking about an inclusiveness, yet if you ask most people today in Britain and many Western parts of the world, they would say that Britain is not inclusive, that they're very exclusive in themselves and very intolerant towards other faith groups and other beliefs. Is that something you recognise, James, those kind of thoughts?
I'd like to look at another aspect, actually, for a second, and that is the aspect of, I suppose, Britain's tradition as an open island, a melting pot, in some ways a little bit like America, where you've had waves of immigrants coming down the centuries and so on. And it's been very open. And you can see in recent times, because of Britain's colonial past, for better or for worse, many people coming from other countries in the Commonwealth and settling here. And the interesting, whatever you might think of the colonial era and all the damage that was done, one of the things that is often appreciated by the people who experienced British colonial rule was the arrival of Christianity. Great that the colonial masters disappeared so quickly, but you still gave something of value. So now it's interesting that some of the people who are bringing the gospel afresh to these shores are people from places like Zimbabwe and other countries in Africa. And they have this vibrant faith that in some ways we have to relearn.
How do we relearn that? Because as British, we're a little bit reserved. And there seems to be a various different type of worship that is brought into defining what Christianity then is.
And I don't think it's only worship. It's not only worship styles. It's also those private practices of prayer and sharing your faith and so on. And British people, as you say, are very, very reserved. Its faith is almost at the core of your being. You're not going to share that with just anybody. You might have a cup of tea, you might talk about the football, but talking about someone's faith and your own faith takes a deal of courage and a deal of trust and intimacy. I think we can learn something of people's openness to talking about those core issues from the new wave of Christians who are coming. Yeah.
Could it be that the reservedness of Brits has actually played a large part in Christianity declining?
I would say so. I mean, it's interesting, at my parents' generation, one of the old adages was there are two things you can't talk about at a polite dinner party, and you know what I'm going to say. It's religion and politics. And actually, those are the most interesting topics to discuss. But because they're topics which in the past have created conflict, then there have been these sort of rules of polite society which have in some ways dampened down the debate. That it has been a little bit retrograde, especially to the prospects of Christianity with its special claims to being relevant to people.
And it seems almost like it kind of slides a little bit in the background then, because you can't talk about politics, you can't talk about religion generally. If that is a polite way of engaging, you don't, because you don't have it at the forefront the way you experienced in Northern Ireland and with that upbringing. Do you see a big contrast how religion is more of a part of everyday society?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that I found certainly when I came over to England the first time was the fact that people didn't seem to talk to each other. I can remember, my first home, you didn't know who your neighbours were. You would have gone months maybe without saying as much as a hi or a bye. Whereas in Ireland, people just stop in the street and talk to each other. It's another wet day. Christianity is very much a part of the culture, and church is very much a part of the culture. And so certainly growing up, it was a fairly safe assumption that most of the people you came in contact with went to church, and had an idea of what Christianity was all about, and very much the majority of folk that work ethic, the strong values of goodness and fairness was very much a part of the majority population. What we refer to it as the silent majority in many circumstances, because they simply didn't get involved with the conflict. Most people just wanted to get on with their lives, and their Christian beliefs, in many ways, certainly in Northern Ireland, carried them through that 30-year conflict. And so, it was very much a part of their lives and a part of their community.
And could it also be that we're even having this discussion, is Britain a Christian nation, because of the silent majority who are Christian in the country might be more silent than the minority of newer religions coming in and claiming a vocal piece in the media? Could that be part of the reason?
Yeah, I think so. I think there is this reservedness, which means that when you get a TV show like The Big Question and so on, then it tends to be the Muslim person who is actually sort of militating for religious freedom and speaking up for faith in general. And the Anglicans and the Christians sort of sit back and are a little bit tight-lipped about it. But I suppose that if you look at the debate today and you look at the challenges which faith is facing, I'm thinking particularly from the quite militant atheists and Richard Dawkins and company and so on, who are really throwing down the gauntlet and saying God doesn't exist, or he's not relevant, or he doesn't have a good reputation, etc. Christians have to talk up a little bit to defend their faith, to explain why it's relevant and why the other approach is not the right one to take.
So in a way, even though there seems to be a threat to the Christian faith from other religions, it's a good thing for the Christian faith.
In some ways, yes, but because it encourages a slightly more a recognition that it is possible, even within a pluralistic society, to speak up for what you believe. And I think that's a good example which is being set by some of these guys, so that you don't just have to roll over and take the punches.
And what we're also hearing is that children who go to school will meet other children of other faith, and their kids are, because they come from a minority religion or a minority group, they will be more articulate sometimes in saying, well, I'm so-and-so, and this is what we do. And a child growing up in an average British home is like going home saying, well, what do I do? What does it mean to be a Christian? And maybe more child-driven families coming into a contact with the Christian church. Is that something you've come across?
I think when, in many ways, asking that question, is Britain Christian, has actually helped people ask themselves, why? What are the values that I as a Christian bring to the world in which I live? Do I bring those Christian values with me into school? Do I bring those Christian values with me into work? Do I bring them into the swimming club or the badminton club when I play my games? Do I seek to play fairly, or do if no one sees the shuttlecock going out, then or me picking up the golf ball and maybe dropping it onto the green out of the rough, These are things that I think, in many ways challenge us to know why we are the way we are, not just, for me personally today, but historically and culturally. Because I think those are things that are important for us now, but they're also important for the next generation. Because, if we choose to ignore where they came from, over time, I think their relevance and their power will just wane away. And people I think in the long run, aren't really interested in doing things for the sake of doing them. They really want to know, why do I have to behave, or why do I have to be this way?
And is the why, the why that kind of drives people to re-examine themselves. But we also have to admit that we live in a Bible literate society. A lot of children don't know the stories, don't know those kind of moral values passed on through Bible stories that a previous generation, definitely our grandparents, grew up with. How do we bridge that gap?
I think it is a gap, and it's a gap in terms of understanding, which is opening up. But if you think about, say, for instance, a history student, and you're looking at the Reformation period, and a lot of history students have to do that, but you do it without an understanding of the different brands of Christianity which are there in the 16th century, then you're not going to understand Reformation. You're going to think that it was a purely political happening. That wasn't the case. If you're thinking about the forces that shaped the language of Shakespeare, for instance, or the Elizabethan period and onwards, then you must also think about the Bible and the translations of the Bible into the vernacular at the time. So a great deal of our literature, our art, our architecture has been shaped by Christianity. Our greatest buildings are Christian buildings. And if we don't understand what's going on in those buildings, then we're going to miss a huge amount. So even culturally, I think it's extremely important to transmit an understanding of what those previous generations were living through and trying to achieve.
And how do we do that when we see there is such a sharp increase in people saying they don't believe in anything anymore?
Well, I think the two things are slightly different. I think having a cultural awareness and appreciating great buildings is different from having a faith. And having a faith is, in my opinion, much more significant than the paraphernalia that turns around Christianity. And it's at that level, that level of faith, I think, that we need to be encouraging people to speak up for their experience. What made them become a Christian? How does it affect their life, their own personal choices? Because a nation, in a sense, it's the sum of its parts. All of those people and their faith, their daily walk with Christ, that makes a difference to the culture of a community and a place.
And I think we tend to drop everything to a very individualistic level. About what can I offer? But I think as a whole, the church has a role to play in transmitting these values and continuing to transmit these values. I think there is a shift in the cultures we live in from one generation to the next, and in many ways each generation has to figure out why these things are relevant to us. not just adopt them wholesale from the previous one. We do have to ask those questions. And I think, we have an opportunity to reflect upon what makes Britain a Christian country. And I think as a church, we can take that question and say, well, actually, do you know what? We can take these values and we need to, and they continue to be relevant, but how do we live that out as a corporate body? And how do we influence the various levels of society in a way that has a positive impact, and not the negative impact that so many people seem to associate with Christianity?
But James, you were also saying that it's about your personal faith journey. So do we really need to have that corporate Christianity driving the nation, or should we be happy with people's personal faith journey?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, because I think that in the end, the personal faith journey is what's most important for each individual. Salvation is individual; it's not corporate. But at the same time, there are places where it's easier for faith to grow and places where it's more difficult. Very difficult to be a Christian in Saudi Arabia or Morocco or a place where freedom of worship is strictly limited. So freedom of worship and the framework, the legal framework within which faith operates is extremely important. And I think that's also things like the media, how Christianity, what sort of exposure it gets within the media, within the publishing industry. Those things matter a great deal. If you look at the bookshelves of some of our major bookstores, and you look for the section on religion, you might not find it. You might find natural history has replaced religion, because that's the story which is being told about our origins, which I think it leaves a lot to be desired. So the space that you have to be able to communicate your message in a society matters a great deal. Now, sometimes that's about the legal framework, the role of the state in that, the role of the public media, the role of private sector, and sometimes it's about how the individual sort of lives within that context.
And how you actually contribute as that individual of faith to the larger pieces of society.
To the larger pieces of society, or churches as institutions who have a role in talking to the decision makers and saying, hang on a second, it would be good if, for instance, there would be freedom to be able to witness in the workplace. Something that I come across periodically as people who work, say, in the health service or in the education sector, and who cannot witness to their faith. They're prevented by the state from doing that, when what they think would be most valuable to the patient, the cancer patient that they're dealing with, or perhaps to the student who is learning biology or chemistry with them, is something which has also that faith perspective. So I think we have a role, or church bodies and organizations have a role in making deciders and opinion makers actually aware of the influence that they have.
Well, I want to say thank you to both of you for coming in and discussing such an interesting topic. Why not add your voice to the debate by joining us on our Facebook page @Faith Talks. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.